Good morning, everyone. It is a privilege to be a servant of the King on a morning like this one and to be able to be with you and to help serve you all this morning, as I hope that you're excited to be here as well. It is absolutely a blessing, not just on a day like today, but in a time like this time, a world like this world, in which there is a lot going on. Yesterday alone, for instance, I saw several headlines, and this is just Saturday. This isn't over the course of the week, but on one day, a 24-hour period of time, I saw the headline that a company had been using now human brain cells to power a computer to be able to play video games. I saw another ad, or not an ad, but another headline that said that Canada is set to surpass 100,000 usages of its MAID program, which, if you're not familiar with the MAID program, the acronym stands for Medically Assisted in Death, or Medical Assistance in Death. They're set to pass 100,000 deaths through this problem. It's a state-funded suicide program. This is more than Canada's losses in all of World War II. Another headline said that OpenAI's head of robotics has resigned, citing that their company has now designed robots that can use lethal autonomy and surveillance without the need for human authorization any longer. I also saw a headline that said that a number of popular medications have all now been categorized with smoking in the same category of cancer-causing agents. Again, these are very popular medications that are used by many people in this country. And that was just yesterday alone. If you add to that things that have been going on this week, this month, this year, you've got rampant inflation. You've got another war that has started. You've got the potential for all of us to be able to doom scroll on our phones endlessly as long as the page keeps refreshing. We have growing false religions, AI and its development and its use in the job market and what that will do for people's jobs, ethnocentrism developing not only in other places but in this country as well. It all just feels like way too much. It reminds me of a story that was reported about the famous inventor Nikola Tesla in 1898 when he was showing off his most recent invention, a remote-controlled boat. And that's amazing to me, mind-boggling almost, to think about that going on back in the late 1800s. And it was amazing to the people at the time as well, where one person came up just completely taken aback by this technological marvel. And he said, you know, this has tremendous applications, the tremendous uses for a military application. And struck by that statement, Tesla turned to him and said, "You may yet live to see man-made horrors beyond comprehension." And that line has stuck with me and many people for the age that we live in, is it feels like we are living in the time of man-made horrors beyond comprehension. What are you supposed to do about all of that? It feels like too much. It feels like we need a reset button. Do you remember how most of the problems with our computers could have been solved with, have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? Unplugging it from the power and plugging it back in? Have you tried that? And often it would fix the problem. It would give a little bit of a reset for your computer. Can't we do that with the stuff we see around us? Like, for instance, where's the internet plugged in? Can I pull that out? And I think a lot of our problems would be solved very quickly. However, that's not the way it works. And that won't actually fix problems that we deal with in the world around us. In fact, I saw a post recently that said, somebody said, your preachers aren't talking about these issues that are happening. Well, here's the actual problem, is that preachers are, I know many preachers especially, who are talking about these things, but the biblical solutions, the biblical reset for living in a complicated world does not often sound like the solutions that people are looking for. And that's what we're going to talk about in our lesson this morning, is having a biblical reset in a complicated world. And to do that means that we're going to have to reset a lot about ourselves especially, so that we can meet these changing times and these man-made horrors and whatever else may come. And so for this morning, let's turn our Bibles over to Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1. We're going to read through all of this chapter, a little bit of the next one, And we're going to learn how to reset ourselves. And that has to begin with resetting our mind. Paul in chapter 3, verse 1 says, "Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things that are on the earth." Over the years, I've had the opportunity to give this advice to many different people, often who are worrying about things that are going on in the world. And so I give them this passage. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes people will respond with, "Well, isn't that just escapism? Isn't that just checking out, sticking my head in the sand, and ignoring these realities that are happening around me?" Well, as we'll see in a few minutes, and if you'll be patient with me, I do not believe that this is escapism. Instead of having your head in the sand, if you will, it's more of having your head in the clouds. That is to say, not being unaware or even just idealistic and ignoring realities, but approaching the world and its issues with God's solutions in mind. That is to say, that if we are informed by heavenly things, if we are motivated by heavenly things, that will change the way that we interact in the world in a very tangible way. And so I do not believe that this is escapism. In fact, this is the only way to appropriately tackle the problems that pop up around us in this complicated world. And so let's go to the next few verses to make one more point here. That is to say that you can't have escapism, that is leaving from a situation mentally, physically, whatever, if you're not there to begin with. Let's see what Paul says in verses 3 through 4. "For you," he says, "have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory." This is a fascinating, entirely different way of looking at the world than the world will offer. Paul says, you're already dead. You're a dead man walking, and the life that we have now is not for ourselves to create our own solutions. The life that we have now is Christ, seated at the right hand of the Father, that he is in the heavenly places, and so that's where our mind should be too. You've died. You're not from here anymore. You are already gone. And so you can't say that it's escapism if we understand that we aren't from here. It's fascinating reading this last week to look at verse 4 once more. When Christ, who is our life, Christ is our life, this is not our life. Which means that I'm going to start thinking now differently about how the world works and how complicated it is. Now, if we do this first step, reset our mind, reset our motivations, reset where we derive our information from, if we reset all these things, then there's going to be several other downstream effects. Most especially that we will reset our bodies. We'll reset how we live our lives here in the physical on the ground. Let's continue in verses 5 through 7. This is Colossians chapter 3. "Therefore," so notice this is a conclusion. If you've reset your mind, well, here's what will happen. "Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience. And in them you also once walked when you were living in them." The implication here is don't live like the world does anymore. I mean, that should be an obvious thing. But when we are worried and distracted by the cares of the world, like we talked about with the parable of the sower, we're starting to think their way and we'll start to use their solutions. You have to reset your mind and then reset your body. Look at the list in verse 5 that we read just a moment ago and consider the alternatives to these ideas, these words, these practices. Instead of immorality, what is moral? Instead of impurity, what is pure? What is passion? What is reason? What comes from evil desire? What is righteous? And what is greedy or what's content? And then, of course, he characterizes, I believe, not just the greed, but all of these things here as idolatry, that these are the worship of false gods or demonstrate the worship of things that are not God. And so the alternative to idolatry is piety, it's service to the Father. What if our lives began to look like this now? That's what it means to reset our body. When we were living in the world, we were the things in verse 5 straight out. But now that we are dead and gone, we prove that we aren't from around here anymore. I had the opportunity the other day, yesterday in fact, to take my kids out to this local rock and gem show. They kind of advertised it like a rock show on the signs. And it's a nerdy thing, I know. It's something I used to do as a kid. I thought, hey, it'd be fun to take the kids out there. And there were all sorts of booths that were there in the arena, all sorts of neat displays, jewelry that people had made by hand, rocks that they'd found and polished up and made to look nice, including many booths that were selling just these perfectly nice spheres, including spheres of calcite. Now, not to get a little wonky or weird for you here, but calcite, is this fairly common mineral. It's a salt, essentially. It's all over the place. And as a kid, I used to collect a lot of it. And it looks kind of cloudy white, the crystals do. And so you can polish it up and make it look nice for a desk ornament or anything like that. But what I noticed here was that all the calcite in this booth was all orange, almost honey-colored. It was amazing to look at. It's very deep luster. And I went up to one of the stands and I asked the person there, I've never seen calcite like this. What's going on with this? And the first thing he said to me was, he gave me kind of a look and he goes, "You're not from around here, are you?" And I thought that's funny, that was the shibboleth. That was the thing that told off that I was not from around here. And so he said, this is a local thing. This pops up all over here around this part of Utah. And I thought, how fascinating that he was able to tell where I was from by the way I acted, the questions that I asked, and that, like we say, you're not from around here, are you? When we're talking about verses 5 through 7 here and resetting our body, we've got to prove to the people around us that our minds are different. We aren't from around here, and we're going to act the same way. And so look at verse 5 through 7 again. Consider the members of your earthly body as dead to these things, because in verse 7, you were once this, but you're not from around here anymore. Continue down to verses 8 through 10. He says, but now you also put them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you've laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge, according to the image of the one who created him. You've got different ways of thinking now, he says, a true knowledge, not this false knowledge that's constantly given to us by our phones, our computers, even the AIs. I don't know if you've seen the joke recently, and I'm sure it will change over time. But I've seen people go to ask their AIs a question, hey, tell me about this fact, and the AI will give a response, will give an answer that is not true. And the person asking the question will say, well, wait a second, I know that answer is false. And the AI will say, you got me. And then it will try to give the right answer, and sometimes it'll fix it and sometimes it won't. That is to say that this computer is not equipped to handle all these things yet. And again, it may get better, but if it does, what then? For instance, people are asking in the realms of the arts or of intellectual property, things like writing books or essays, that at what point do we move from a person conveying the things that are actually in their mind and being able to call that my work that I put out into the world, versus now using a computer to ghost write for me or to ghost paint for me? And right now, of course, the pictures and the text are all a bit wonky. But what happens when it gets better and better? We live now in both an age of hyperbole and an age of lies. That is to say that you've got lots of people that are putting out things that they're claiming as their own thoughts, their own views on things, their own sermons, for instance, but are actually lying in that they are written by a computer. They're drawn by a computer. We live in the age of hyperbole because, like in verse 8, You can go on social media and yell and rant at anybody that you want to. You can talk to your friends about how awful these people are, or those elected officials, or whoever are, and you can take that to the full number 10. You turn that volume up. And Paul is saying here in verse 8, put those things away from you. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, abusive speech. That's Twitter in a nutshell. Put those things away from you. Don't talk that way. Don't think that way. And then in verse 9, don't lie to one another. You're going to have to think about that very strongly, very clearly when it comes to the age that we're living in. An age that capitalizes on hyperbole and lies. The solution is, of course, to speak the truth. To say what is true. When everybody is stopping thinking for themselves, when everybody is falsely calling some machine learning knowledge, asking the AI, hey, is this news article true? Is this true? Is that true? Is that idea a good one? And so forth. When we start taking this knowledge away and replacing it with something else, Paul says we've got to come to a true knowledge in verse 10. And that true knowledge is of the Christ, the one in whose image we are created and are expected to conform ourselves. If we'll speak the truth with each other in the truest possible sense, then we're going to have to talk about what the Christ has done in the world and in us. Look at verse 11. He says here that there is a renewal, that is this process that we've been renewed in. This is a renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, and free man. We could even continue if we just keep drawing the principle out. There's no difference between Democrat and Republican, between authoritarian and libertarian, between all these different political beliefs or ethnic beliefs or whatever the case is. Here's all that remains. Here's the true knowledge, the renewal, the truth is Christ is all and in all. You and I all have the potential, and everyone out there has the potential to come to the truth which is Christ. We've got to be able to live in a true way, having reset our minds to reset our bodies. And this is made easier if we're willing to reset our purpose. That as we show a glimpse of the world to come, as we're living here in the now, we're showing people that we have a different reason for being. The reason that the MAID program in Canada and in California and various places has gotten so popular, it seems, is because so many people have lost their purpose. I saw one just recently of a person who decided to enter the program because while they were living in their studio apartment and they were living on disability, they're not been able to work for some time, this person felt like they had no reason for living, and so decided to enter into that program. Christ allows us to not just reset our minds and our bodies, but reset our purpose, our reason for living. He gives us something that transcends the complicated world. Let's go to verses 12 through 14. First of all, he tells us here that you are one of God's chosen people. That doesn't mean that you're an American and you're his chosen people, or you're an Israelite or you're his chosen people, or you're whatever other ethnicity or nationality that makes it his chosen people. You are above those things. And not just because you're you and you're extra special, or I'm me and so forth. We are this way because we are living a life which has been remade by the sacrifice of the Christ. Look at verse 12. So, which is another way to say, therefore, if we've done all these things up till now. He says, so as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, forgiving each other. Whoever has, a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. This isn't the kind of love that you hear people say in the slogans, love wins or so forth, and use that to justify all sorts of earthly behavior, sensual behavior, and so on and so forth. This is a real love, a love that cannot tolerate certain things that are evil. This is a love which actually unites people in perfect bond. And if we are willing, as the chosen of God, with this new purpose, to live a life that looks at it this way, that looks through that lens, then we're going to have to start asking questions of how I respond to the world and its complicated mess has to be looked at through the lens of service to the King. Look at verses 15 through 17. He says, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which you were indeed called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell richly within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns, spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Whatever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father." And at the time of writing this, Paul was living in a period of history which they and we also, as modern historians, would call the Pax Romana, meaning the peace of Rome, which, as far as things go, was a period from the mid-hundreds BC to the the 2nd century AD, where Rome was relatively at peace. And if you weren't living on the furthest outskirts, if you were living closer to the heart of the empire, you would have not had to deal with all the problems that come from rebellions and conquest and all that. You would have lived a relatively comfortable life, especially, absolutely, as a Roman citizen, to live in the peace of Rome. And did you know that now, in the United States, from World War II and on, we are living in a period that the historians have been calling the Pax Americana. And we, of course, know that during that period of time, you've got the Vietnam War, the Korean War, you've got all these different conflicts and difficulties and scandals and so forth. Generally speaking, if you lived in the heart of the country, you don't have to worry about the difficulties that are going on in the rest of the world. But all these things have to come to an end. The Pax Romana came to an end. I wonder in the future what the history books will say about the time period we're living in now. Maybe it has already come to the end, this Pax Americana. Maybe things will get more difficult. I imagine, because history shows, that we've not yet seen in our lifetimes the complete terrible nature of where we can go as humans. But notice what Paul says in verse 15. He's not talking about the Pax Romana, or even for us that we should apply the Pax Americana. He's saying, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Who cares about the Romans? Who cares about the American government? Let the peace of Christ, the Pax Christos, if you will, rule in your hearts. Let that be your reason for living, this hope that you have. And so as Paul continues in verse 16, he says also, let the word of Christ richly dwell within you. And he says that we're supposed to sing. And one of the questions that you should ask when you're reading a passage like this is, why out of the blue did Paul start talking about how we should be singing to each other? Well, for me personally, one of the genres of music that I appreciate the most is American folk music. I like it because it's simple music with relatively few instruments, the kind of music that you could play as a family in your living room, or you could go to see a huge concert for. It covers everything in between, and it tells stories, typically, about just common human experience, things that Americans would have understood, would have lived throughout their lives. It's very relatable. I enjoy the music for that reason. But sometimes American folk music can have kind of a melancholic edge to it, where it makes you feel a little sad, makes you feel a little nostalgic, like there was a life that either you have lived or you could have lived in the past, which has gone by, which has passed us on. And so there's that sadness that comes through it from time to time, where you're kind of looking back and you're living in a civilization that's not that anymore, that has declined in some metric or another. But when Paul's talking here in verse 16 about how we should be singing with each other, I think you could think about it a little differently. That we're not looking to the past, but we are looking for the future. We're singing songs about the great kingdom that we are yet to see in its fullness as God had intended. We are living in the kingdom right now, yes, but we're singing songs of hope for a future. We sang two songs. Well, we sang one song, and we'll sing another song here in just a little bit. The song that we sang right before the lesson was Troublesome Times Are Here, and that's kind of what we're talking about. It's funny how the last several weeks we've had songs right before the lesson. Gary and I haven't talked about this or anything. Songs before the lesson that fit really well with what we're about to talk about. And I remember when I was a kid hearing somebody talk about that song, Troublesome Times, and go, I don't like this song because it talks about doom, people's doom is coming and so forth. I don't like that. But that is the reality. Judgment is coming. There is a doom, there is a decision which is going to be made. And with the realization of that knowledge, that truth, that there will be a renewal and there will be a judgment, you got to change your lives, is what the song's inviting you to think about. And so when I think of that song, I don't see that as this negative, sad song. In fact, the song talks about this positive thing where we're getting ready to go and see Him. We are singing songs about a future, hopeful songs in thankfulness to God for what He has done so that we'll understand what He will do. We're singing songs of the new world in the deepening ashes of the old one. And so let's reset that purpose that drives us. Let's reset our thinking about these so that our bodies and our speech, our singing follows suit. Now, at this point in the lesson, I imagine that folks might say, oh, okay, but like we started this all off with, there's some weird, crazy, complicated stuff going on that I wish would all stop. How can I fix this? What can I actually do to change anything? Well, here's where you get part of the answer. And I don't know, you might like this, you might not. But here's how we can reset the role that we play in the world. And Paul will begin in these next few verses by showing us some very tangible, very practical application. But before we get to that, I'd like to detour for a moment over to 1 John chapter 2 and verses 15 through 17. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. There, John says, do not love the world nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father. It's from the world. The world, he says in verse 17, and I especially want us to pay attention to this, the world is passing away, and also its lusts. But the one who does the will of God lives forever. Their life is hidden with Christ on high. Thinking about that last verse, verse 17, I understand very well that it can be sad watching something that you love sink. You think of all the stories of romantic sailors that have loved their boat. They've named her a girl's name, and they talk about her like they're her bride, or sorry, that it's her bride, their bride. It's funny how people do those sort of things. They love these boats. They talk about them in the way that they do. They keep them safe. They keep them afloat. They are their livelihood and so forth. And so they speak about them, even though it's just an object, in very affectionate ways. And it can be sad to see that go down. This is where you get stories like captains going down with their ship and so forth. Now, I don't know if you've heard this before, but they'll tell you that if you're on a sinking boat, one of your goals is to not only get off, but to get as far away from that boat as possible. The reason is because as the boat goes down and all the interior cabins that are filled with air, when that ruptures and that air bubble rises to the surface, that will create a void which will suck other things down with it very fast, deeper than you can, faster than you can swim back to the surface to catch a lungful of air. It's dangerous to cling to a sinking ship. And so John is telling us here in this passage, the world is sinking, and I believe what that means is don't get caught going down with it. So that brings us back to Colossians chapter 3. Let's start reading in verse 18. Colossians chapter 3. Well, how can I reset my role? How can I change the way I live my life to affect this crazy world around me? Well, based on what Paul's told us up till now, let's start reading again. Verse 18. Wives, here's what you can do. Be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Well, hold on a second. That doesn't feel like that's going to change what's going on with robotics and AI and the misuse of the human body and so forth. I don't know what that's going to do. It's going to help. Keep watching. Keep reading. Verse 19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. The idea behind this word for embittered is also like sharpness. Like don't let that relationship become a sharp thing, become something that might tear the tension in two. The idea here is love them, be compassionate towards them, be gentle towards them, patient. Look at verse 20. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. On the other hand, verse 21, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. That's a hard verse to read, especially as a dad, someone who wants to bring up your children well, who wants to set standards and rules for them, which are good things. But it is exasperating to not live the way that I've told the rest of the world how it needs to be, or my children how it needs to be. We've got to reset our roles. Wives, husbands, children, fathers. Let's keep going. Verse 22, slaves. Now, if we get ready to read this passage and we go, I'm just going to ignore this because, slavery has been abolished and so forth, I don't know if we actually understand the situation we live in the world. If you've got a loan, go ahead and think that you're free to not pay that and see what's going to happen. We are slaves in some capacity. Whether you are a wage worker working a 9 to 5, or if you're on a salary or whatever the case is, if you've got debt, if you've got bills, if you've got all these other different things going on, we are slaves in this kind of capacity. In fact, there's many places in Roman culture where a slave might have had better possibilities than you and I do, where, for instance, a servant would be living in a household, would be provided with rent as they provided work. We just watched, the kids and I, we just started Mary Poppins. And if you've seen that before, you know that there's the servants that are there, there's the maid, and there's the cook. And those folks live in the house. They're provided this for. And of course, they're trying to hire a nanny who's going to be a live-in nanny. She's going to live there full time and work there. So she's provided food. She's provided housing. All these different things which we are trying to scrabble for today. You talk about Gen Z's prospects as far as what they expect to be able to find rent or a home. They are abysmal. And so in a lot of ways, older slaves, and we're not talking about, of course, chattel slavery or man-stealing, but to be a servant in somebody's home was in large part a benefit. And so I think we can read a verse like this in verse 22 and on and see that this is very relevant to today. He says, slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. You're not doing this just to get by, just to avoid, the ire of a frustrated boss or whatever. You're doing this because your mind is different. Now your actions are different, your body's different. You've reset your purpose, you've reset your role. And so when I work for an employer, I'm looking at this as I am working for the Lord and I will do my best. In verse 23, he continues, whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. When you think about an inheritance, it's true in Bible times, as well as in times past, servants and slaves were not children. They were not sons. And so you could work for that person all your life and you wouldn't have an inheritance. You wouldn't have any sort of lifelong kickback as being a part of that family is the idea. And so here's where it's now different. Think about the way that you work for your boss and think about the ease of which people can kind of push you out of a company or get you, laid off, just we're moving in a different direction or whatever the case is. How easily that can happen, and maybe at best they'll give you some severance pay, a golden handshake, whatever, but no inheritance, no lifelong possession in a family. Your work will talk a lot about how we're family here, and then let's see how far that stretches when it becomes difficult. Here Christ is promising us something better, that if we will work for our bosses, our masters, our employers here on earth, as we are working for him, they will do whatever they'll do, but he will give you inheritance. It is the Lord Christ the king that you serve. Verse 25, for he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong he has done, and that without partiality. So if I, as a worker, as a servant, do something that's wrong because I say, well, they did something wrong to me, so, they laid me off, so I'm going to steal stuff on the way out or whatever the case is, I'll have to answer for that. They will too, but I'll have to answer for that. The they will, in verse 1 here of the next chapter, continues. He says, masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. If you happen to be here and you are an employer, you're someone who has employees work for you, this is very relevant to you. Work for them in a just way, in a fair way. Treat them like you would want to be treated, because you also have a master, and you would hope for the same from him. Again, how does this fix stuff that's going on in the world? It seems like we've really taken a detour, and this is where people will say things like, your preacher doesn't talk about how to solve this stuff. This is how you do it. Your home is the first dominion, the first realm that you get to work in, that you really get to change stuff in. Your work is then that next dominion where you actually have some influence. You have some say based on how you work. And even if you're not the boss, even if you're not in charge of, like a task force or anything like that, you have say in what you do there. There's a quote from G.K. Chesterton that I have come to appreciate more and more the older that I get, and it's this. The most extraordinary thing in the world is an ordinary man and an ordinary woman and their ordinary children. He's on to something there. That's what Paul's talking about. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. And here's what you do with that. You live in an appropriate way in your role as God has designed it. We don't have to think anymore like, man, I sure hope that our leaders do the right thing. I sure hope that the corporations do the right thing. I sure hope that these nations do the right thing when they're fighting against each other. I don't have to think about that anymore. I can do what I can here, which changes everything about how we wage war on the earth. We just started, it seems, a new war or police action or whatever we're going to call it. But how do wars get fought when you reset your mind? How do things change in this way? Well, let's go to chapter 4, verses 2 through 6 of Colossians. Chapter 4, 2 through 6. If you can reset your home front, as it were, you can now devote yourself to biblical warfare. In verse 2, he says, devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving, praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up a door for the word so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I also have been imprisoned, that I may make it clear in the way I ought to speak. Let's stop there for a second. That first line in verse 2 sounds very much like soldiers in a combat environment who need to, when it's time to sleep, put somebody on watch. Somebody needs to be awake at all hours so that we are not ambushed, we're not taken advantage of, we're not conquered by the opposing force. He says, devote yourselves to this kind of combat, prayer. And then also, keep alert in it with thanksgiving, an attitude, he says, of thanksgiving. That is incredibly useful and practical. Pray and be alert in that way. It's easy to be put to sleep by things that are going on when you're scrolling through headlines and so forth. Be alert with prayer. Let's keep going through our passage, verse 5. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how to respond to each person. And I don't know if you see it here, but this is what Paul is saying about how to now strike out at the enemy. How do we conquer our enemies, our foes, our difficulties in the world, all these people who are told are our enemies around us? How do we fight that? With speech that is graceful and true. He uses an analogy here, which reminds me of some meat that we recently purchased from Costco. I am terrible when it comes to grilling things about, making sure that if it needs to be marinated, it's marinated properly. I always forget, I don't get the recipe right, whatever the case is. And so we had bought some carne asada meat that was already marinated and seasoned. And I think it came in like a 3.5-pound pack or something like that. And I thought, this is going to be plenty for the kids. They're not going to eat this much. So we grilled it up. We made some little street tacos with it. And as I started to see the meat dwindle on the cutting board, the kids were just eating it up. It was well seasoned. It was well marinated. It was, sometimes you joke, it's like sweet meat. It was easy to ingest. The kids could not stop eating it. Now, with the analogy that Paul uses here in verse 6, he says, our speech should be graceful. It should be seasoned with salt. And the idea there is this is like a meat. This is something that is very helpful to our bodies, that it strengthens us, it nourishes us, it tastes good. And people, when they get a hold of food like that, can't stop eating it up. Even then, maybe I'm a bit too full already. What if we approached the way that we talk with people about the Christ in this way? This does not mean, of course, and obviously, to soften truth or to hide truth. It means to present the truth and how it works in the world. That is graceful speech. It's talking about the grace of Christ, after all. So when you look at a passage like this, he's showed us that resetting our minds causes everything else to follow. We reset our bodies and our practices. We reset then our roles and how we play and interact with each other so that we can reset our purpose. We view now the reason that we do things very differently so that we can now wage a warfare. We can reset the way we think about warfare to be something that helps the kingdom of Christ. And then we can let the peace of Christ rule in our hearts. So I want to finish out this lesson with a couple of questions for you, some things to think about. From chapter 3, verse 1, all the way down to chapter 4, verse 6, how else could we do things that would change the world around us than this? What different could we do than what Paul says here? For instance, for those of you who might view political leaders as the main problem, are you going to vote them out? We've lived for quite a while in a place where, because of the particular politics of the region, where our vote did not matter. It just didn't add up in the whole scheme of things. And so, all the other decisions were made through the Electoral College and different things like that. It just didn't matter. So are we going to vote them out? We have election after election where everybody says this is the most pivotal election of our lifetime, and we vote out the old person, and the new person comes in, and it feels just like the same thing. Are we going to stop all the wars? Again, speaking of the same thing, we've been telling ourselves for generations, ever since I was a kid and beyond, that we're done with these things, and yet here we are, doing it again. Can you stop the wars? We know that something about the human experience is that we will always have wars here on the earth. James says in James chapter 4 that we'll do that because people want what they want, and people will always want what they want. So are we going to stop that? Are we going to arrest all the pedophiles that exist in this country? Do we have the position, the power, the authority to do that sort of thing? People have been saying they would for a long time, and that keeps not happening. Or do you have the power or the authority to stop these corporations, to stop this or that, to stop crime, to stop the way that people think about things? Brethren, I believe that those problems are too far beyond our sphere of influence. We can't change those things, but here's something we can change. I can do the right thing in my life right here, right now. We ought not complain when we go into the world and we say, look at all these problems, and then I'm not willing to make a good decision at work to serve my coworkers, to serve my boss. I'm not willing to do the right thing when I come home to my family. And I have an opportunity to raise them and encourage them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. If I will not do that, I ought not expect that anything else will change either. We, brethren, have a reset. We have the potential to do what Christ has commanded us, the right thing right now. And even though there are extraordinary evils in the world, and it's possible that we may not have even seen how bad it can get, you and I can do what is extraordinarily good here, in our congregation, in your family, at your work. Take the advantage to do those things and to serve the Christ, the Lord. And if you're here this morning and you have not done so, you've not entered into his kingdom through baptism, you've not responded to the gospel of grace of our Lord, if you've not done those things, then come to him and be saved from this perverse generation. If you'd like to do so this morning, if you'd like to talk more about what that is, please let us know as we stand and sing this song together.